On June the 23rd, it looks like this is going to be a very close vote. So if I can actually persuade 4 people who may not have made their minds to switch one way or another, that might actually have a substantial impact on what happens. I think the first and key thing is that with regard to the European Union, we are not talking about free trade. We are talking about a single market. This is a much more intense experience than a free trade zone. The proposition of the European Union is that it is in the advantages of business and the economies of all of the countries involved, not merely to allow trade. I haven't heard anyone suggest there shouldn't be trade between us and the other EU countries, but that we need a single regulatory system to apply across all 28 member states. That's the proposition of EU membership. It is not an insane proposition, by the way. And I can remember back to when the single market was founded in 1992. And the reasons for having a single market, not merely a trading area, were pretty clear. The example was given to me by my Italian professor of economics at Oxford University. And he put up a slide showing the different regulatory rules around a tractor in what was then 12 member states of the European Union in the single market. And he explained what the problem was in just having a free trade area. And he went through the different tractor regulations. I can't remember all of them, but I think I'm right in saying that in Portugal, the regulation was that the front wheels of the tractor and the back wheels of the tractor needed to be in exactly a ratio of 2 to 3. In Spain, I think it had to be in an exact ratio of 3 to 4. In Belgium, the glass on the windscreen of the tractor had to be exactly half an inch thick. In Finland, there had to be an escape hatch on the top. Why Finns can't just get out of tractors from the side door like everybody else, I don't know. It was a different regulation. When you looked at all of these 15 regulations together, different in different member states of the EU, these were effectively non-tariff barriers to trade. Nobody could make a tractor economically that would fit each of the regulatory standards in each of the countries. You either had to make a tractor that was fit for the Spanish market or the Portuguese market or the Belgian market or whatever. The idea of the single market project was to have a single regulatory standard. If the windscreen is good enough in Belgium, it's good enough in Portugal. If the wheels on the back are secure enough in Spain, they're good enough for Italy. That is the concept behind it. That is essentially what we are being asked to vote on June the 23rd, is do we wish to be a part of that single market, single regulatory structure? It's not about trade. Before we joined the single market, before it was even conceived of, it was perfectly open for British tractor makers to trade with French tractor makers. It is about whether you want a single regulatory zone across the European Union. I was rather attracted to this idea that we needed one set of rules, however crazy these rules might be, better to have one set than 15. I found that attractive. But I've changed my mind in the last 10 years, and I want to tell you why. I don't believe that the single regulatory zone, which is essentially what the single market is actually lowering the necessary requirements to do business. I think it is increasing those requirements. So whilst it is annoying to have a dozen or more different regulations about tractors in different member states, it isn't the case that we are seeing a lowering of regulations across the single market. In fact, we are seeing greater and more intense interference in the name of a single regulatory standard. Secondly, it's increasingly evident to me that we don't need a single regulatory standard in the European Union. It is not particularly problematic if wine bottles in France are slightly different to wine bottles in Italy or the United Kingdom. It does not require us to have, for example, on cigarette packets, exactly the same health warning in Belgium and the United Kingdom. But the European Union has become obsessed, in my view, with a single rule for all. So we actually have an EU which is now genuinely arguing about what exact proportion of a cigarette packet needs to be given over to a health warning and what exactly should be on that packet. Put aside where you stand on health warnings on cigarette packets, it seems to me crazy that we are moving to that single regulatory standard. So I think we've actually seen a good idea go sour in the last 2 decades. Free trade is not the issue. We have access, as the United Kingdom, to an economic area worth about $20 trillion per annum. Chile, South Korea have managed to get free trade agreements without being members of the European Union. There is no problem on trade. The entire issue is on regulatory standards. The proportion of our trade with the EU is the next issue. We do most of our trade with the EU, we're told nearly half, some of the people on the Remain side will say, and therefore to be part of this market is crucial. I query that, partly because I think if we leave, there won't be a problem in continuing to trade in, and secondly because of the general trajectory about where our trade is going. Back in the day, our trade with France would have been more substantial than it is now. We are probably looking at around 40 to 45% of trade with the European Union at present. But an awful lot of this is selling in to the European Union in order for those products to be moved on. This is something which is called the Rotterdam effect. We might actually be selling a product which on our books goes to Holland, but is actually its final destination point is, say, Singapore. So from the UK's perspective, we've done a deal with the Dutch, but actually from a global trading perspective, the product is destined for outside of the European Union overall. So the trend is to a more global trading economy, rather than because France is a mere 30 miles away over the English Channel and Portugal are our oldest and most trusted neighbours, we need to do business with them. The growth of global capitalism and free trade means actually our ability today to sell into Japan, China, Singapore or India is actually much greater than it was even 10 or 20 years ago. Physical proximity is not a key factor about where we do trade. So our long run trade outlook, to my mind, looks as if we can expect, whether we stay or whether we go, that our trade will increase proportionately with the rest of the world and decrease proportionately with France, Belgium, Holland and the rest. There is a further problem about being locked in to this particular market, because whilst you might argue that a single regulatory framework around what a tractor looks like or what a cigarette packet looks like is helpful to facilitate trade within the EU, it erects quite substantial barriers against other non-EU countries. So we have an external tariff problem. It's all very well that we can do business very easily with the Portuguese or the Dutch, but we can't do business as easily with the Singaporeans, the Kenyans or the Indians in virtue of being in this trade bloc. External tariff barriers are high. I think the best example of that is the common agricultural policy. We have made a decision as the European Union to subsidise and support relatively affluent Western farmers and to keep out of our market cheaper produce from Africa, South America or the rest. There is a protectionist element from the EU to the outside of the European Union, even if within the market it's fairly free-flowing. The other issue, which I sometimes hear from the Remain side, and I'm not completely opposed to this suggestion, is that were we to leave, we would no longer have a seat round the table making the rules, we would just have to abide by them. And far better, whatever you think of the rules, that we have a seat round the table to design them, than to just have them faxed to us by the European Commission. There is some truth in this, but only a modest amount. It is true that if we wish to sell into the single market having left the European Union, we will have to abide by single market standards. If there are rules around insurance products or labelling that apply in Portugal or France and we wish to sell products on that basis, we will have to abide by those rules. This is hardly surprising in that it applies to every country on planet Earth. If we wish to sell something to America, we actually have to comply with US standards. without actually having a seat in Congress or the Senate or any power in the Oval Office. We have to comply by US standards. The thing that would change, and why I'm relatively optimistic about Britain on the outside, is it is still a rarity to see a company that's principal business is selling into the European Union. And at present, the single market rules govern internal trade within the UK. So if you are making a bottle of wine or a tractor or a motor car or a packet of cigarettes, and you are not intending that to go to export to Portugal or Belgium or anywhere else, you are within the UK bound by EU standards, not merely if you're selling to the EU. And I think I'm right in saying that only about 1 in 20 UK businesses actually sell into the European Union. Typically larger businesses, but 1 in 20. 19 out of 20 UK businesses are therefore focused entirely on domestic trade, and that domestic trade is regulated by EU single market rules, even though there is not a single product or service that is going across the English Channel. So for the bulk of business, which is largely people in the east of London selling things to people in the west of London, or people in Manchester selling things to people in Liverpool, for the bulk of our trade, we would no longer be bound by the single regulatory framework, the single market as it is called. What is the burden of that regulation? You know what, this is incredibly hard to measure. And again, statistics are flung around about, do 80% of our rules come from Brussels? Is it 50%? What's the burden of those rules? Was it our fault anyway because we didn't veto those rules? Or maybe even these rules were invented in the United Kingdom. It's difficult to get an exact number on it, but something like 70% of regulations around what's acceptable and legal in the market are EU rules. Now, you might make a judgment about whether on the outside we are likely to be even more finicky and regulatory as the United Kingdom. Perhaps we'll have even more stringent standards on what counts as a legal insurance policy, as a legally compliant tractor, the acceptable size of a windscreen on a motor car. It is possible that we will find that we don't liberalise on the outside, but it will be up to us. It will be up to us. The United Kingdom government will not be able to shield behind any fig leaf or external rules from Brussels. It will be their decision and theirs alone. So I think that there are good reasons to be on the outside, essentially for transparency. If you want a lower regulated state, which I do, I think we could get that. But whatever the regulations are that British business would face would be governed by our Parliament and our government, and they would be answerable to that, to us. There wouldn't be a question of them saying, oh, well, it's a Council of Ministers ruling. There wouldn't be an oblique understanding or oversight of what regulations look like. What could the UK look like in the future? One of the principal concerns, I think, is around the City of London. Are our financial services pretty much our greatest comparative advantage in a global capitalised world? Are they going to be under threat if we are no longer part of the single market? Is there a real necessity for the City of London, more or less our greatest proposition to planet Earth in terms of our global trade, is that going to be undermined? I think not, or if it is going to be undermined, that won't be related to our membership of the European Union, it will be related to our non-membership of the Eurozone. We were told that if we didn't join the single currency, the City of London would be at a catastrophic disadvantage. And there may even have been some disadvantages associated with us not being in. The European Central Bank is in Frankfurt. Probably if we had joined in 1999 and been one of the founder members of the Euro, the European Central Bank might be in London. You could argue. But our absence from the Eurozone has not cost the City of London any substantial or major disadvantages as a global trading centre, despite all of the claims that it would do so. And these same claims are being made today, that if we're on the outside, we'll be at a colossal disadvantage. I think those claims are enormously overstated. We may be at a minor disadvantage by not being in the Eurozone, by different rules relating to sterling to Eurozone trading, but it is not a colossal disadvantage. So I think the City of London can expect to carry on more or less as is, whether we are in the European Union or not. It is not an existential threat. There could be an existential threat by staying in, because it is not in the interests, broadly speaking, of the other 27 member states to have a benign regulatory environment for financial services. This is of colossal importance to the United Kingdom. It is of vanishingly small importance to, say, Portugal or to Italy. It is simply not part of their wider economic proposition to the wider world. I think it is possible, if we stay in, that we will find regulations from the European Union which are not ideal for the City of London and are a matter of basically supreme indifference to the other 27 member states, it not being their principal proposition on trading in financial services. Furthermore, if we stay in, I think there are risks about how the European Union will go and develop. The way that the argument is being framed is that some people are saying you've got to explain exactly what Brexit would look like. What will the United Kingdom look like in 5 or 10 years' time were we to leave? Well, I think it's unreasonable in this debate to only ask one side to predict the future. It seems to me that whether we stay or go, we cannot be certain exactly what the United Kingdom will look like in 2020 or 2030. There are risks on both sides. There is not a clear prospectus of what the EU or the United Kingdom will look like, whether we stay or whether we go in 10 years' time. Some people, I think, very unhelpfully in the argument, are trying to pretend that there is. Her Majesty's Treasury issued a document suggesting that they have perfectly worked out exactly what UK GDP will be in 2030. And having crunched the numbers through an algorithm, they can tell us with absolute certainty and sincerity that each household will be £4,300 worse off if we leave than if we stay. This is hogwash and nonsense. There are a million different possible futures, none of which are predictable. Were we to stay, what is the European Union going to look like? Is it going to become a more heavy-handed regulatory state, or is it going to actually start to become a competitive area in the global economy? If we leave, what sort of judgments would we make on the outside? Would we become a higher tax, higher regulation economy, or the opposite? These are imponderables and unknowables. Please do not cast your vote in any way based on a document from Her Majesty's government telling you exactly what they think the economy will look like in 14 years' time. So bad are economic predictions, and I say this as somebody who works for an economic think tank, that they are revised every 3 months. We tend to say that our growth rate in the next quarter is going to be 0.8%. Oh, it's just been revised down to 0.6%. We think that the government budget deficit might be 20 billion or 15 billion, continually revised over a period of time of 12 weeks. For anyone to say, with anything approaching certainty or sincerity, what the UK economy would look like in 2030 is a guess. It is a gambit. It is not a serious economic prediction. It will depend what we do if we leave or what we do if we stay. And I think if we stay, there are some measurable and substantial risks involved. The two greatest problems facing the European Union in recent weeks, months, probably over the last few years, has been the instability of the Eurozone and bailouts to the Greek government, and a possibility that other member states will go the same way and will be harder to bail out. Dealing with Greece, which I think is about 2% of the Eurozone economy, is one thing. Were Italy or France or Spain to hit the same sort of problems, the bailout would be hugely greater. The EU has not found a stable way of dealing with the Eurozone and the budget deficits of countries that are struggling to cope as Eurozone members. I don't see anything to believe that in the next 5 or 10 years, the Greek position is certain to get better rather than worse. I'm not making a firm prediction, but it's not obvious to me that we're seeing straws in the wind that will sort this out. We could actually see it spreading. We could actually have a problem which is not merely the size of Greece, but is the size of Italy, Spain, or Portugal. I can't say that for sure, but it is a risk of staying in if we are part of a ship, an economy that has holes under the waterline. There has to be a chance or a risk of that. I think the banking sector in Italy and Greece is looking particularly dangerous. The other issue about whether were we to stay is what does our ability look like to trade with the wider world? I am just old enough that I can remember the debate about the 1975 referendum. And one of the arguments put at the time was we need to leave behind the Commonwealth. These are the vestiges of empire, and modernity is actually Western Europe and trading with France and Germany, rather than hankering after the Raj or our relationships with African nations or the rest, that the Commonwealth is a huge diplomatic relationship but not a serious economic proposition. And actually I think in 1975 there was some strength to that argument. It was possible to say that Britain was in post-imperial hangover, was not open to its most immediate markets in Western Europe, and needed therefore to change the way we were doing things in order to lock ourselves in, more particularly to our immediate neighbours. Today, however, the position is rather different. If you are to look at which are the parts of the economy that are growing rapidly, actually a good part of this is the Commonwealth, the ex-British Empire. Do you think over the next 10 or 20 years, is your money on Portugal and Greece growing as dynamic economies, or is it on India growing as a dynamic economy? Again, one can't be sure, but I would say that the likely trajectory is that global growth is going to be outside of the European Union, and our long-term future is best secured by doubling down on those early, rather limited relationships, rather than being concerned about having a single regulatory structure with Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, France, and Portugal. It's important but nevertheless declining markets. So if your view is that over the next 10 or 20 years that global growth is going to be outside of the EU, and I think I'm right in saying that other than Antarctica, the European Union is the only continent which is diminishing as a proportion of global trade, then I think we need to have a very radically different approach to how we trade and what arrangements we want. And it's not obvious to me that locking ourselves in to a single European regulatory structure is the best way of achieving or dealing with that. So I think I'm going to wrap up by saying I think there are no certainties at all on either side, stay or remain. I don't believe that the argument is reasonably about free trade. Whether we stay or remain, we will continue to buy French wine and German cars, and we will sell them insurance products and pharmaceuticals. That really isn't at risk. You can argue on the margin whether we would be slightly better if we stayed in or slightly worse, but it is not an existential issue. The existential issue is this: what should the United Kingdom look like, and what should our strategy be for 5, 10, 15 or 20 years ahead? And in my view, the best strategy there is to open ourselves up to genuinely international markets rather than merely Western European markets. That is a declining base. Angela Merkel, in her wisdom, I think, put the problem that the European Union faces rather well. And I don't blame the European Union institutions for this, it's just a fact about its member states. The EU is 7% of the world's population. It is 25% of world income, but it is 50% of all global state spending. 50% of all spending across planet Earth by the government happens within the European Union. 7% of the people, 25% of the income, 50% of total government across planet Earth. I think this is a structure, a continent, and a set of arrangements whose time has passed and is gone, that might have worked in the 70s, 80s or 90s, but is not fit for purpose in the 21st century. It's colossal problems that it's facing, the Eurozone being in permanent crisis, the migrant crisis, it seems incapable of dealing with. There is no swift, decisive response. There is vast amounts of regulation about what constitutes an acceptable level of suction on a vacuum cleaner, but no actual ability to deal with colossal economic instability in some of the outlying Eurozone areas or 500,000 people trying to enter the continent. I'm not prejudging what the solution should be to those problems. I'm just saying the European Union in its present structure hasn't even begun to tackle them. I don't see any chance that that will improve. I think there are risks if we choose to leave the European Union, but I think the choice will be ours, and the deck of cards that we can play with and the options that we will have in order to actually adapt our economy to a global future in which we are seeing what were previously incredibly poor countries growing at 6, 7, 8% a year is the more optimistic, forward-looking and long-term strategic approach to a strong and prosperous UK economy. And for those reasons, I've decided to vote Leave on June the 23rd. Thanks very much for your time and attention.